So picking up where we left off, um, percentile ranks aren't perfect, just like any other measurement. And if we want to look at how all these things fit together, we have this, normal curve here that may or may not be true, but when we're talking about taking samples of people, it actually is true, especially when we're taking big samples. And so that's wonderful, but that's a story for another time, although I'm sure you're all incredibly interested. So we have our standard deviation scores. We have our cumulative percentages, and then that goes into our percentiles. So we start down at 0 and top out at about 100. We have our z-scores. We have t-scores, which is just like a z-score, actually only has a mean of 50 and a standard deviation of 10. They're commonly used. Something called normal curve equivalents that are so stupid that I'm not even going to waste my time anymore talking about them. Again, another something that people thought would be a good idea, but they're more trouble than they're worth. Stanines, which again are really half standard deviation units, but unfortunately, of course, this middle half standard deviation straddles the middle of the distribution and contains about 20% of all scores, and they're kind of worthless because percentile ranks give you a much better source of information. And then we have the percentages, and then they have just IQ scores here. But this all fits together in terms of norm reference scores. And if I wanted to scale any score, like IQ has, for this particular IQ test, the mean is always 100, and the test has changed over the years. But what they always do, no matter how many questions are on it, no matter how many different ways they score people's responses, they always make the mean 100 and they always make the standard deviation 15. And that is an example then of a commonly used scaled score. Now, on the bottom, if we go back to way back, and I wish I, had a different way to do this, but if we look back at this initial output, we were looking at the norm reference scores. Down below are criterion reference scores, and there are a couple things to note about them. One, they still use the idea of error in the sense that there's a diamond for where you score and a range for where you probably are. Again, the diamond is your observed or obtained score. The line is supposed to represent where your true score probably is. If you look at this, I have my sections broken down into their component parts. Reading, basic understanding, analyzing text, and so on. I have my language, my math, my science, my social studies. Now, I have a couple indicators here, and I have my mastery level. And again, if I look at this, there are 3 basic categories: non-mastery, partial mastery, and mastery. And if you look at each one of these, or how all these numbers line up, the OPI represents the percentage of items you've gotten correct. Anything between 0 and 50, or up to 50, is non-mastery. From 50 to 75, you have partial mastery, and from 75% on, you have mastery. So note that these percentages probably don't really equate to the same things as letter grades. So getting a 61% in economic perspectives puts you smack dab in the middle of partial mastery. It isn't mastery, but I don't think a 61 would be an F, or would mean that you should get an F in these cases. It's a different kind of test, and so again, we're not expecting people to get 100% in most cases. And from this, you can look at what are students' areas of strengths, what are the students' areas of weaknesses, and so on. And ignore this national stanine, that's just from the top of the other one. If we're going to look at what the Wkce report looks like currently, it's similar to this. It's got scaled scores, it's got state percentiles, and it's got performance levels. There are good and bad things about this. If you look at this, you have your scaled score. They have the cut scores that are reflected in this graph here. You have your student, and then you have your state percentile. So this student is really good in reading, not so good in math, decent in language arts, pretty good in science, and pretty good in social studies. I find the difference between reading and language arts to be somewhat striking in this case. Um, yeah, it doesn't really seem consistent, although maybe they're just not really good writers and so on. If we look at each one of these bars, one of the things that they don't have in this is that they do have the student score, but they don't have that range of where their score probably is. And so they're taking the error out of it. They do have, like the previous example we were looking at, this idea of, academic need, some academic need, relative academic strength and academic strength. And if you ever look at Consumer Reports, they use kind of the same thing to look at their cars, and they break it down into four things: the hollow zero, the bottom half, the top half, and then the full thing. So if you're looking at this student, obviously reading is an academic strength. Mathematics, not so hot. Language arts, there is an academic strength in writing, and then you have this language, which is some academic need, or I should say relative academic strength, and then research and inquiry, which also is a relative academic strength. But I'm surprised, I mean, this is simulated data, it's not real, but that seems somewhat inconsistent. But then again, they are measuring different things, so it doesn't have to match up perfectly. We look at science, we can break it down into all the different areas of science. And if you look at the social studies, you can break it down into all the different areas of social studies. And if you look at the state standards, and you recall the social studies standards, these are the 5 areas of social studies. These are the 6 areas of science, and so on. So the test is designed to measure progress towards state-designed or state-identified objectives. You'll also notice at the bottom there is the writing score is separate from this. And what you're looking at here is that basically you're looking at conventions, meaning spelling and grammar, and composition is organization of ideas and so on. And when we were looking at those essays in the social studies area, those were things that we thought of as being somewhat important, but this is how the state decided to break them down. And it's a common way. It makes sense and for a lot of things and so on. But this is what an individual student who takes a WKCE, this is what their profile report looks like. One thing that we can do from this is then compile it across the school and then look at how our students and how our school compares within our district or within our state. And so if you look at the state averages, right? Okay, reading, not so hot. Language arts, terrible across the state. Mathematics, not so hot. Science, decent but not great. And social studies seems to be the best across the state. Now, one of the things that you might argue with this is that, well, maybe our curriculums aren't well designed. Maybe our social studies standards are either too easy or our language arts standards are too difficult. Because it doesn't make sense in a lot of ways to have across the state these massive differences in areas of strength and weaknesses. But that again is a policy issue and not really something that we have time. Well, I suppose we could take time to talk about it. But we won't get anything accomplished really by doing that, because I don't think any of you in the class have the political clout necessary to make changes at this time, but perhaps in the future. We look at the district averages, and so if you look at this district, we can see that within this district, you are above the state averages. Same in language arts, same in math, not so much in science actually. Science seems to be a weak area of this district. And then in social studies, you're also actually weaker in some areas, stronger in others, than the state averages. If you look at the writing totals, again, you don't have these proficiency things, you just have these average ratings. This is a very good district in terms of writing relative to the average of the states. And if we look at our school, we can look at our school's strengths and weaknesses, and typically schools will more closely mirror the district than they will the state. And when we look at state averages, we're looking at most of the scores come from public schools in large cities. And if that's where you get the majority of the data, you also have these high concentrations of poverty and so on, and language issues, and all sorts of developmental issues as well, that are reflected in the test scores. But as a teacher or as an administrator, somebody who works in a school, or as a parent, you may look at a school's report cards, and you can do this on something called WINS, where all this data is available for all the schools and everything like that, which is kind of nice. You can look at, well, what do I think my child is going to need help in, or what do I think their areas of strength are, or what do I want them to be good at? Well, if I really care about reading and language and think that that's the greatest thing in the world, I should probably find this school to be a good fit. However, if I'm looking at my son or daughter becoming a little scientist, perhaps I should choose a different school, because science relative to the state in this particular school is kind of weak. Then you have all the different students and their particular scores and so on, and you can look at any individual student, and you can look across grades and all sorts of stuff. And these are just different ways that you can use this data to make decisions. You also have the Wisconsin or WKCE for students with disabilities. And if you look at this, this is all criterion based. If you look at the reading, the math, the science, and so on, right, it's just percentage of point earns. Total points gross that you could get are possible. Your student got 7 out of the 30, and that puts them at this percentage. We don't lump them in with the norm reference data in this case, because they are taking the test, they're taking a different test under different conditions. And so we don't have norms for those people, because disabilities are different, and we're focusing on a very small area of the ability range as well, and it's tough to get reliable estimates down there. But this is basically what it would look like for the students in your class if they were, or if they qualified, I suppose you could say, to take this version of the WKCE. They still have to take a version, but it's not the same one. And that concludes our exciting foray into standardized tests. I will be attaching a set of questions about this, and these are the kinds of questions about the output that I will be asking on the final. You have some standardized output, and I'd like you to try to answer these questions based on what you have learned thus far. If you look at part 2, I'm using this WKC Terra Nova output that I was talking about in the video, and I'd like you to answer these questions. We'll go over these when you get back on Monday. See if you have any questions. I'll throw in a few more things, and then we'll start talking about map testing. So I hope you're all having a wonderful weekend, and that Thanksgiving is just treating you great, and you did not eat too much if you celebrated. So see you on Monday. Bye-bye.